of cyber from the front lines. And today I would like to welcome Suril Desai from Calvio. Did I pronounce it right? Cool. Uh, Sunil is the Vice President of Engineering at Calvio, and I'm really glad, Sunil, we could set this up and talk about cyber deception. So with that, let me welcome Suril. Suril, welcome to the pod. How are things at your end?
Thanks, Arun. Great to be on the pod and happy to discuss cyber deception today.
Awesome, awesome. So before we begin talking about deception, I always wonder how you got into cyber, how did you get into this field of cyber deception?
Sure. So, I've been in cybersecurity for a long time. And so, at a previous company, we were building authentication systems
Mhm,
which protecting, multiple type of verticals, including credit card payment authentication, the 3D secure payment protocol that has been used quite extensively for financial services. And so that was basically a prevention-based approach. But ultimately, the idea was that, attackers can always get in beyond prevention defenses. And so effectively, uh, you know, then Acalvio was started by my co-founders, and so I joined them to work on an approach to actually detect the threats that are getting into the environment. And so that is how my journey got started.
That's great. That's great. So why don't we get into it? What exactly, for those who do not know what cyber deception is, what exactly does cyber deception refer to, and could you just walk through that?
Right. So cyber deception is effectively an approach where you can set traps for the attacker. And so the whole objective of deception is to create, fake entities in the environment. So these could represent, decoys in the network. They could represent deceptive credentials, fake credentials on the endpoint. They
Mhm,
could represent, users in an identity store like Active Directory. So you can have deceptions of many different types. They can be decoys, they can be honey tokens. But ultimately, the whole idea is that you're setting traps for the attacker, placing these traps at strategic places where the attacker is likely to go,
mhm.
and then be able to detect the attacker.
That's interesting, pretty interesting, because usually always talk about honeypots, but they're more at the network layer, and here the concept is more having these traps at different levels, um, and making sure that either at one of these levels you trap the or you deceive the attacker. That's interesting, pretty nice.
Yes, it's effectively this the derives if its origins from the concept of honeypots, but
Mm,
ultimately it's a completely reimagined idea where honeypots were traditionally used for, purposes, a little bit of academic purposes or research purposes, where you could stand up a set
mhm,
of internet-facing entities, which were honeypots, and look for activities and then generate some form of threat intelligence.
mhm,
And so then in the 2010s, a bunch of companies were formed to actually look at in the mid 2010s onwards, 2015 and so on, were to looking at can you reimagine the concept of honeypots and then apply it for detecting threats also which are inside the enterprise environment.
mm.
And so that was basically the origin of what we call as today's dynamic deception platforms. And so that has effectively expanded the horizon of deception, and it's now used for purposes of detecting the threat, for purposes of threat hunting, and to engage with the attacker as well.
That's awesome. That's interesting. So just to dig a bit deeper into it, you mentioned things like threat hunting or engaging with the attacker. Does that involve uh, simulating or creating a test box environment where you are actually analyzing the traffic that is coming from the attacker and then using that to simulate that environment as well?
Right. So the idea with engaging the attacker is basically you can set what we call as traps representing high interaction decoys. So effectively, the decoys can be of many different levels of interaction in deception, where depending on the purpose. So one of the purposes of decoys is to be able to just detect the threats.
Mm,
And if you want to just detect the threat, it's almost like knowing is there a bad actor in the environment. So you need enough visibility to know that there is a threat, and then you can decide to cut off the attacker at that point of time.
mhm, mhm,
But there are often use cases, for example, in federal cases or in advanced large enterprises where they want to know the motive of the threat. So they want to collect additional visibility from attacker TTP point of view. Now, in order to achieve that, there's an approach where you can deploy what we call as high interaction decoys, where you're actually providing a full decoy environment. The attacker can successfully go into that environment, continue their attacker actions, and the defender gets visibility into what is the attacker really after. And so
mm.
that's the approach of engaging. Uh,
Engaging with the actor. Interesting. So, in terms of if we try to understand what kind of role cyber deception would play in the modern cyber defense strategy, what would you say? Where will it, how we can use this methodology in improving the posture within an organization?
right. So this is effectively one of the key areas where cyber deception is shining, where if you look at traditional forms of security, they're based on observing the activity that is occurring in the environment and then applying analytics to the observations to be able to determine what is malicious.
Mm,
And those approaches can be of many different types. You can look at the logs and you can perform log analytics. Then you can write detection rules. You can also do anomaly based detection approaches. And so that's one category of approaches, which is effectively looking at activity and then attempting to classify activity as malicious. Typically, those type of approaches are, while they are useful, they are good at trying to find known threats. And so where if you know that you are going to be dealing with a particular category of malware or a
mhm,
particular CVE is being exploited, so if you know the nature of the threat ahead of time,
right.
then these approaches are likely to work. But in the modern threat landscape, attackers have many different stealthy methodologies that are difficult to predict ahead of time. So, for example, identity compromise,
Mm,
where the attacker gets access to a legitimate credential of an employee and then uses that credential to perform lateral movement. The other example is living off the land attacks, where attackers are using built-in operating system tools and utilities for offensive purposes. Insider threats is yet another case where the insider who has trusted access to resources is abusing it. And then now comes the advent of AI and so generating new attacker methods. So all of that becomes ways where traditional security would not be able to detect because you don't know the nature of the threat ahead of time. And so
mhm,
now, if you want to get detection coverage for that, which are visibility gaps in traditional security controls, then one needs an approach that is being able to detect agnostic to the attacker TTPs.
mhm,
And that is what cyber deception provides, where you are not trying to detect the threat based on a known TTP necessarily. Instead, you're saying, what is the goal of the attacker? And
mhm,
you're trying to set a trap based on the goal
mhm.
and detect any usage against that trap. And so that way you can actually eliminate your visibility gaps, strengthen your security posture as part of ultimately a defense in depth approach.
That's interesting. That's pretty good from a defense in-depth strategy, like you mentioned.
Right.
So, in terms of advances in AI is like taking off big time. How do you see it impacting the threat landscape, and how does deception come into the picture there?
Absolutely. That's a good question. And, so AI is effectively as changing everything as the world around us, and so including offensive security. And so the idea is that, if you look at AI from the offensive side, there are many ramifications of the advances in AI. For example, recent research last year in 2024 from UIUC, University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign researchers found that there were a way for LLMs, large language models, to exploit in an autonomous manner what is called as one-day vulnerability exploits.
Mhm.
These are, vulnerabilities for which a patch is available but has not yet been applied.
Right.
So by simply reading the description of the CVE information from MITRE, which is all publicly available to everyone, LLMs are able to generate in an autonomous manner an exploit for that type of a CVE.
Mhm.
Now, the idea is that that means if that can be done through an LLM, this is dramatically going to increase the threat landscape exposure, because even though that would have been possible in the earlier world, it requires building an exploit requires lots of skill. And so only the most advanced attackers have a way to find, those type of one-day exploits and actually succeed. But if the machine can do it,
Mhm.
and then, then it reduces the skill barrier from the threat actor significantly. They can just throw the machine at the problem. CV descriptions are available. LLMs can study them and autonomously exploit them.
Mhm.
And as we know that, if it's a one-day exploit, because unpatched, by definition, that not get defended against in traditional security. And so that's one change. The other change was Google recently announced the fact that the world's first zero day was found through another different LLM by
Oh.
Google's DeepMind research firm. And so they published research. And so now that means the complexity goes up even more, because effectively the LLM is able to, in that case, it was done against the SQLite library, which is a very popular underneath open source library used for powering many databases. And
Mhm.
so Google's models were able to analyze the source code of SQLite and found a zero-day exploit, and showcase that this was exploitable. And
Mhm.
which means that if that is, as we look at the landscape going forward in 2025 and beyond, these type of zero days, if the propensity goes up significantly, then clearly the defense needs a completely different approach, a paradigm shift, as many of the analysts are calling it, because reactive approaches that need to know the threat a priori will no longer be sufficient. And
Mhm.
you instead need proactive, or what we call as preemptive approaches, where you can detect threats independent of the attacker's methods. And cyber deception is one such technique. And so that's an excellent way
Mhm.
to bolster your defenses.
Noted. Yeah. Especially with the advances in AI, it's just going to get more and more and more complicated and lower for the defenders, and lower the barrier of entry for the attackers. So definitely, like
Absolutely.
you said, preemptive way or proactive way to deal with that is the need of the hour. Um,
Right.
I was kind of curious, where does this, when we talk about the deception platform, where exactly does it fit in? Does it fit at the network layer, at the host layer, or is it all of the above?
Yeah, well, that's a very good point. And so effectively now there are different, the deception as such is a concept.
Mm.
Different vendors have taken their own approach of where they position their product. But in general, from a applicability perspective, deception can apply at all layers of the stack. So,
Mm.
for example, in the network, you can deploy, decoys to detect, lateral movement, network propagation, vulnerability exploit attempts. On the host, one can deploy credential deceptions like honeytokens, where you're looking for attackers who have got access to a host through, let's say, phishing,
Mhm.
and are then looking for credentials to further propagate in the environment. So by putting deceptions on the host, you can get an early warning of an attacker action. Then the other place where deceptions would apply is identity stores.
Mm,
So for example, a catalog like Active Directory for on-prem or even cloud workloads and cloud catalogs. So the whole idea with that is to be able to detect the attacker who's performing a reconnaissance or an enumeration against a catalog and then trying to propagate in the environment. So effectively, that concept can be applied strategically at many different places of the environment to get comprehensive coverage.
okay. So, how does alerting work then? I'm assuming the platform would be uh, ingesting or sending alerts to your monitoring platform you send, um, and that means analysts need to be trained on that aspect. And plus, was kind of curious your take on how does cyber threat intel can it feed into this platform from the deception platform that you were talking about?
Very, very good points. And so, from an alerting perspective, the observation is typically done through some of the deception artifacts. So, for
Mm,
example, decoys can observe the attacker actions. There are other cases where integrations might be required for the observation. So, for example, if host credential deceptions are used against a real asset, then one can look at logs, let's say, for example, on the domain controller or at the SIM to be able to analyze this usage. So, alerting observation can be done through decoys or through other integration methods. And then the question comes in about how do you make the analyst experience better? So that can be done through various mechanisms. One of the ways is to actually take those alerts and then to use industry standards, like for example, MITRE, which
mm,
is one of the standards bodies and is doing a lot of excellent work in classification of threats. So that can be used as a baseline to say the alerts are then mapped to a standards framework like MITRE. Now the SOC analyst who's already using MITRE for consuming other type of alerts
mhm,
can get deception alerts based off MITRE mappings and then use the MITRE framework for their corresponding investigation and response actions. And so from a threat intel perspective, there are definitely use cases for threat intelligence, both for consuming threat intelligence in deception as well as generating it. So
mhm,
from a consumption perspective, threat intel feeds provide things like IP reputation, URL reputation, finding out, compromised users. So deception platforms can ingest that type of a threat intel and use it to enrich the alerts. So for example, if a attacker uses a compromised user and then goes against a decoy,
mhm,
then one can look at the alert and then use the threat intel feed to further correlate it and say this is known to be a compromised user. And as a result, the alert can be annotated that way and the severity can be bumped up. So various
mhm,
type of alert correlation actions can be done.
mhm,
And deception platforms also can generate threat intel. For example, specifically in the case of high interaction decoys, especially there where you're getting visibility into attacker TTPs,
mhm.
that can be then consumed and used as a source of generating threat intel.
Yeah, that's a very good point. You could kind of flip it and use it as a source of intel as well. Uh,
Exactly.
Related to that, like you also touched upon threat hunting, emulation. I feel like with the data set available to the platform, I think could be a very, very valuable source for detection engineering as well, or providing that kind of insight, how exactly the threat actor is uh, trying to breach your network or getting credentials or any other attacks that they try to launch. So yeah, that's a pretty interesting. Also wanted to touch upon typical use cases that could be leveraged for deception within an organization. If you could elaborate on different use cases.
Sure. Absolutely. And deception is a technology and use case is always very important because to get value for the customer through the powerful technologies is of prime importance. So there are many different use cases that one can achieve in deception. A few of them include, like, the baseline use case is an early warning system
Mm,
where you can actually get a set of deceptions deployed. And the advantage of deception is as soon as an attacker goes touches the deception, you get an alert. And so you don't have to wait for the signal to build up and then confirm the alert like with traditional security. So it's very rapid detection. So that's the baseline use case. Then there are many other specific use cases. For example, in identity security, there's the category called identity threat detection and response, or
mhm,
ITDR. And so, ITDR is about detecting identity attacks, and especially attacks that target Active Directory are one of the important things that threat actors go after.
mhm,
Ransomware, for example, Alfie ransomware from 2024 targeted Active Directory. Many APT groups target Active Directory also,
mhm,
and detecting Active Directory attacks is very challenging. For example, recent guidelines from the NSA and the Five Eyes security agencies, when they looked at Active Directory attacks, they analyzed over 17 commonly observed attacks in Active Directory,
mhm,
and they reached the conclusion that, including things like Kerber roasting, ASAP roasting, many advanced threats, they reached the conclusion that traditional approaches, which is log analytics or network traffic inspection, are difficult to detect ID attacks because the attacker actions look equivalent to normal.
mhm,
And so the recommendation was deception tech and honey tokens is an excellent way to detect those threats.
mhm,
So it becomes a very powerful layer for ITDR. So that's one of the other use cases. Insider threats is another important use case for deception because insiders are very challenging to detect.
yeah,
They have trusted access, especially if it's a privileged insider. So
mhm,
deception shines there because you can set different type of traps, including like a special purpose document, and you can detect insiders using that type of deceptive artifact. And so that's one other use case. Detecting zero-day variants of many different type of threats, whether it be AI generated attacks, whether it be
mhm,
zero-day ransomware variants, is another great use case for deception. One of the other popular use cases is defending unmanaged endpoints. So things where an EDR is typically not present. Attackers target unmanaged endpoints all the time. For example, routers, which is being used by Salt Typhoon and Volt Typhoon, routers, gateways,
right.
printers, cameras, legacy workstations. You can't put an EDR on those. Attackers go after that, so you can get fidelity of detection by deploying deceptions. So there's a bunch of such use cases for detection purpose, and then there is of course the threat hunting
Mhm,
use case to be able to find a latent threat and by confirm a hunting hypothesis, and you
right,
can also and generate threat intel using engagement of the attacker.
nice. Yeah, that's appeals to me a lot, especially the threat intel, intelligence generation part of it, as well as hunting, since I'm in that side of the house. It's pretty amazing to see that. Um, I was so curious in terms of legality, right? Or do you see any challenges from any legal or ethical purposes if deception is deployed within an organization's environment?
Right, that's a very good point. And so there's no legal issue because it depends on the use case and how you use deception. So
Mm,
effectively, there are oftentimes concerns where where that the deception is being used to counter attack on the attacker. If you do those things, then there would be a legal implication where you need sort of a permission to go and combat the adversary. But if
mm,
you're using deception as an instrument of detection, so
right.
you would know that there is a threat actor in the environment, then it becomes conceptually similar to other methods of detection from the way it's applied.
Mhm,
It would be equivalent of having a log analytics or having a NDR or a EDR type of a layer. So deception becomes one of the other layers,
mhm,
and it would not then have any legal ramifications, and it brings the power without any of the legal aspects.
Gotcha. Okay, that's good. Good to know. So in terms of implementation, right? So there are different types of, you have big organizations or mid-sized or small businesses. How do you see deception especially when you look at small and mid-sized businesses, limited resources? How do you see deception playing the role, or how could deception platform be implemented there?
Right. Very good point. So effectively, for large enterprises, it's very straightforward that, there's like a tremendous need for deception and uptake as well. So
Mm,
that case is, and they have mature practices, and they realize the need to elevate their security because they just are so much at risk ultimately, and attackers
mhm,
are going to go after the large enterprises. So that is definitely a very, much more intuitive and easy to
mhm,
deploy type of situation or adopt situation. But for SMBs, there are that would depend on the nature of the solution being deployed. So if you adapt the deceptions and tailor them to the environment. So for example, deploying, making the deployment easy is very important for a SMB type of a use case where you can put a set of deceptions without adding IT overheads to the
mhm,
SMB enterprise. For example, more of honey tokens can be deployed on endpoints so that you don't have to take a lot of any resources, and then deploy a few strategic set of decoys. And then, of course, the alerts themselves have to be set up in a way that they can be easily ingested. Many
mhm.
of the SMB markets are being served through MSSP and MDR providers. And so there, even many of those can consider embedding deception as part of a security stack.
Offering.
That way you can offer it
Right,
to
right.
SMBs.
That's interesting. Um, so that brings me to another question, which is more around how to measure the effectiveness when you have the implementation in place. You have the platform, cyber deception platform. How do you measure the effectiveness of that platform?
Right, right. That's again a very important point. And so the thing with effectiveness is of multiple ways. So inherently, there's a conceptual benefit of deception because ultimately, if you do it correctly, if you set the traps at the right places and you set the right type of traps,
Mm,
almost as a by definition case, you will detect the attacker. So that's the concept. Now, to validate that concept, there are multiple methods. So one is typically organizations do what is called as red teaming. And
mm,
so where you set up a deception environment and you run a red team, and now the red team is then there are different type of red teams, some where they know about the presence of deception
mhm,
and others where they do not know about the presence of deception. Both techniques are valid, and in a lot of real world experiences, red teams have always landed up tripping over the deceptions. It also results in a psychological deterrence on the red team. So they land up slowing down because they're not sure of every step on whether it's a trap or not. Sometimes red teams have actually, in our experience, found real objects and classified them incorrectly as a deception. So that can also occur. And so that's typically the way enterprises can measure it. And then the actual real world case studies have also been heavily seen over time where actual threats, for example, ransomware variants, insider attacks, identity attacks are being caught by deception solutions.
nice, nice. So in terms of an example, any success story that you can share about a breach and how deception could have stopped that?
Absolutely. So I'll share with you, a recent example of one of our, uh, you know, uh, customer. This where effectively it's an anonymous, so we can talk about it. And so the idea is that they had a unfortunate incident where they had an insider who was a member of a IAM team, was a disgruntled employee. And so
Mm,
this enterprise has multiple layers of security already deployed. They have, in the Active Directory environment, they had, logging enabled network traffic analysis. They had a PAM solution to protect, service accounts, and then they had on the servers and laptops EDRs deployed, and then they had rolled out some of the honey token accounts into Active Directory as part of a deception rollout. So in this case, the privileged member of the IAM team, who was a disgruntled employee, got access to one of the servers which was used for provisioning and deprovisioning users in Active Directory.
Mm.
And then on that server, there was a script, and the script was run under the context of a service account. And so they went to that server, they checked out the service account from the PAM, and then they used that script to start systematically disabling
Oh, wow.
users in AD. And so that would have effectively taken out the enterprise.
Yeah.
And the interesting part is none of the controls alerted on it. And
Mm.
that's because they observe, but they do not know that this is malicious, because ultimately this is happening from a legitimate employee,
Yeah.
from a real server, using a proper service account at the right time of day. So
Yeah.
all the conditions are met. How do you know that this is malicious? And so the only way the alert occurred was when the threat actor, the insider, landed up attempting to disable a strategically placed honey token account. And
Mm.
because deception does not really care about about the methods of the attacker, the deception immediately alerted. SOC got to know that this was basically a attempt, and then investigated, found out that this was basically an insider. They were able to stop it. And so, in the words of the customer, this was sort of a very scary episode
Mm.
that could have had a lot of impact.
Definitely scary for sure.
Absolutely.
I can imagine the impact it could have caused.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, on that note, when since we touched upon alerting a bit, do you also see false positives when uh, alerts are generated from a deception perspective? I would imagine it would be these alerts would be high fidelity just because of the nature of the platform itself, right?
Right, exactly. So the inherent nature makes it amenable to high fidelity signals where
Mm.
there is very low false positives. However, there are often many things that can exist in an enterprise network and things that vendors need to do. So, for example, there can be a scanner, a
Right.
Qualys or a 7, which that will end up talking to the decoys, and so one needs to find a way to handle those things. There can be sometimes a case where a help desk or a support person lands up attempting to trip over a deception. So there,
Mm.
there are techniques required from different vendor implementations to make sure that those do not result in false alerts.
Mm.
In general, the fidelity is very strong, and if you do the right things from taking care of these type of scenarios, then you can pretty much bring down the false positives down to very close to zero.
Gotcha. Okay, that's interesting. Um, so in terms of customizing the platform itself, I was kind of curious, can deceptions be customized for the industry vertical itself? Is there a way to do that?
Yes, so that is one of the things that is important for vendors to and platforms to provide, because fundamentally the idea is that for deception to be effective, many things are required. One of the things is it needs to look like that part of the enterprise environment,
Mhm.
right? And so, for example, if the attacker is going into a healthcare environment, or the attacker is going into a financial services, they would expect the deceptions to represent those type of assets.
Mhm.
And so as a result, when you're taking the case of a generic deception platform, then and you're trying to deploy that, then it's very important for the platform to be amenable to customizability for a based on a vertical, so that it looks realistic for that asset type.
Yeah, that kind of feeds into how the deception piece would work, especially with the specific verticals. Um, I also had a couple of final questions for you. In terms of the challenges that you see in adoption of cyber deception, could can you just elaborate on any challenge that you see, and how do you overcome that?
I think initially there's more, whenever there's any new approach to cybersecurity, there is typically the awareness
Mm,
challenge, which is, where there is not enough awareness of new approach. And so, defenders are adopting what is already available or known. And so when you take the case of cyber deception, where you reimagined the concept of honeypot and applied it in a completely different rendition, initially there was always the awareness challenge of getting the customer base to understand what does this technology do and
mm,
why it is not, the same as what earlier years honeypots were doing. So that approach is always there. But the idea with that is that once that is done, then in today's world, that is no longer an issue because there's a lot of awareness of deception, whether it be through analysts, whether it be through customers, where we have a significant market awareness on the need for the technology. So
mm,
that barrier has now been crossed. Then it is only about different vendors and the quality of their implementation and making sure they can make it scalable, easy to use. Those type of things are required for a high quality implementation. Ease of use is very important
right,
for a vendor.
absolutely. So final question. How do you see this technology evolving, say, next 5 years or over the next 10 years time frame?
Right. So, there's lots of applications of cyber deception for various type of use cases. So, for example, it has been applied extensively in IT environments now, but enterprises are moving to cloud and
Mm,
especially cloud native, which has been the case for the last few years. So, deception platform would also need to find ways to be able to protect cloud workloads, including cloud native. Then there is the ability to extend deceptions to protect, AI infrastructure,
mm,
which is especially the generative AI stack that is emerging now. And so that's in the sort of the near-term roadmap. And then beyond that, there'll be many other use cases, for example, for 5G and 6G type of security, where you have not no longer, not everything is wired interfaces, and so you're trying to deal with IoT devices which are largely disconnected. And
right.
so finding ways to create to build deception strategies for that are some of the things that this technology will evolve over time.
Mm, awesome. No, this is great. And thank you so much for being on the pod and explaining what cyber deception is. Very, very interesting topic, and I'm sure a lot of people would love to listen and understand what cyber deception is all about. Thank you so much, Suraj.
Thank you, Arun. Thank you.